Right now, in a sealed evidence locker somewhere on a U.S. warship in the Arabian Sea, there's a stack of crates with Farsi manuals stuffed inside anti-ship missile casings, and those crates are the reason Tehran just lit up the Strait of Hormuz for the second time in a week. It's August 16th, everybody. Welcome back to the video. Hope you're doing great wherever you're watching from, and I'm glad you're here for this one because there's a lot to unpack. Here's what we're covering today. A quiet, under-the-radar naval seizure that the Pentagon barely bragged about, an Iranian arsenal that was never supposed to make it out of the shadows, a retaliation campaign that's now hit tankers, oil ports, and even the environment itself, a president who's out here talking about literally declaring the Strait of Hormuz United States territory, and a diplomatic track running through Pakistan that might be the quietest and most important story in this entire war right now. This one connects a lot of dots that most outlets are treating as separate stories, when really they're all one chain reaction. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how they link together. Let's set the stage first, because context matters more than ever right now. We are sitting at day 160-something of this war. Late February, the United States and Israel launched a joint operation against Iran, took out the top of the regime's command structure in the opening hours, and triggered a response that's been rolling ever since. Since then, we've had a ceasefire that never really held, a full-blown naval blockade that squeezed Iran for about 6 weeks straight, a temporary lifting of that blockade after negotiations, and now, since early July, a fresh cycle of Iranian strikes on commercial shipping, followed by American retaliation. And sitting right in the middle of all of that, quietly, almost like a footnote in the daily briefings, is a weapons ship. An Iranian weapons ship that the U.S. Navy seized, and that seizure is a bigger deal than almost anyone is giving it credit for. So let's talk about what actually happened, because the how matters just as much as the what. For months now, there's been a pattern running underneath this entire war. And it's easy to miss if you're only watching the missile strikes and the carrier movements. Iran has never stopped trying to funnel weapons out to its proxy network, specifically the Houthis in Yemen. Even in the middle of getting hammered by two air forces, even with its own navy getting bottled up in port, the regime kept trying to run boats. Small dhows, stateless fishing vessels, sandbooks, anything that doesn't officially belong to a country and therefore doesn't officially belong to anyone when it gets caught. That's the whole point of using them. Deniability. If nobody owns the boat, nobody has to answer for what's inside it. And Tehran can stand up at a podium and claim total ignorance every single time one gets intercepted. And what's been showing up inside these boats over the last year or so is not just rifles anymore. We're talking anti-ship missiles. We're talking components for the Type 358 surface-to-air missile system, the same missile family that's been used to hunt American drones over the Red Sea. We're talking ballistic missile warheads, seekers, guidance fins, drone engines, radar systems, communications gear, and paperwork written in Farsi that ties every single piece back to manufacturers under direct U.S. sanctions and directly affiliated with Iran's Ministry of Defense. One interdiction alone, and this is before the current war even started, pulled in more than 750 tons of hardware. 750 tons. That's not a smuggling operation. That's a supply chain, and it runs in one direction from Iranian ports, through the Gulf of Oman, down toward Yemen, and into the hands of a militia that's currently sitting on the world's busiest shipping choke points on both ends, the Red Sea and now, indirectly, the Strait of Hormuz. So when a U.S. warship rolls up on a stateless vessel in these waters and finds another one of these floating arsenals, that's not some minor customs bust. That's Iran getting caught mid-resupply to a partner force while simultaneously claiming it has zero appetite for wider war. It's the logistics tail of the Axis, and every time one of these boats gets seized, it's a direct hit to Iran's ability to keep its proxies fed, funded, and firing. And right now, with Iran's own navy effectively boxed inside its ports by the American blockade, these smuggling routes are basically the last lifeline left for keeping the Houthis stocked with anything more sophisticated than what they can build themselves in a garage. Cut the boats, cut the missiles. It's that simple. And it's exactly why the U.S. Navy keeps pouring resources into patrol coastal ships and destroyers built for nothing else but this exact mission. Let's actually talk hardware for a second, because the ships doing this work deserve some credit. This kind of interdiction usually starts with a small, fast Cyclone-class patrol coastal vessel, roughly 200 tons, built specifically for close-in work in tight waters, like the Gulf of Oman and the Northern Arabian Sea. These aren't glamorous ships. They don't get the fanfare of an aircraft carrier or a guided missile destroyer, but they're the ones actually pulling alongside a stateless dhow, putting a boarding team on deck, and physically searching cargo holds by hand in blistering heat, sometimes finding nothing, sometimes finding a floor covered in green plastic wrapped missile components. Once something significant gets found, that's when the bigger ships get called in. A guided missile destroyer or cruiser moves in to secure the site, take custody of the material, and provide overwatch in case things go sideways, because you never know if an IRGC fast attack boat is going to come screaming over the horizon. The second word gets out that one of their shipments just got popped. And overhead, more often than not, you've got a maritime patrol aircraft or an armed drone quietly circling, feeding real-time video back to a command center that's watching every second of the boarding unfold, ready to call in support the moment things escalate. That layered approach, small boat up close, destroyer for muscle, aircraft overhead for eyes, is basically the blueprint for every one of these interdictions. And it's the same blueprint that's been refined over nearly a decade of doing exactly this kind of work against exactly this kind of smuggling network. This isn't new. What's new is the scale and the stakes, because doing this in the middle of an active shooting war changes the calculus completely. Every boarding team out there right now knows that popping open the wrong crate could mean finding something that changes the entire strategic picture. And every seizure carries with it the very real possibility that Iran responds within hours, not weeks. Now, let's flip over to Iran's side of the board for a second, because their retaliation options have narrowed dramatically compared to where they stood even a year ago. And that narrowing is exactly why we're seeing this specific pattern of behavior right now. Iran's official position, publicly at least, is defiant as ever. Just this week, Iran's deputy foreign minister put out a statement basically mocking the idea that the United States could ever claim the strait, saying it cannot be seized by a tweet, not by an aircraft carrier, not by an order, not by an election speech. Strong words, confident words, the kind of words a country uses when it wants the world to believe it's still holding all the cards. But confident rhetoric and battlefield reality are two very different things right now, and the gap between them is the whole story. Because within about 24 hours of that statement going out, ships in the Strait of Hormuz started getting hit. Multiple vessels operated by the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, one of the largest energy producers on the planet, were struck while transiting the strait. The UAE's foreign ministry didn't mince words either, calling it a flagrant violation and an unprovoked attack. Maritime monitoring groups confirmed drone strikes on at least 2 tankers around the same window. Minor damage reported, crews accounted for, but the message was unmistakable. This wasn't random. This was retaliation, timed almost perfectly to land right after Western forces scored a win against Iran's smuggling network. When you lose leverage on one front, you open fire on another. That's the pattern, and it's been the pattern for months. And the numbers behind that pattern are honestly staggering when you actually sit down and total them up. Since the beginning of July alone, maritime trade organizations have logged 20 separate reported projectile strike incidents in and around the Strait of Hormuz. 20. Bridge damage, engine room damage, structural damage across a range of merchant vessels, just trying to move oil and gas through one of the most important waterways on Earth. And it's not evenly spread out either. The vast majority, 16 out of 18 of the most recent strikes, have hit ships using what's called the Southern Omani route, which was supposed to be the safer detour around the worst of the danger zone. It isn't safe anymore. Shipping companies are now rerouting north or straight up aborting planned transits altogether, not because the direct route got worse, but because there is no direct route left that Iran hasn't figured out how to threaten. Only 151 ships made it in or out of the strait in the most recent 7-day reporting window. Compare that to the hundreds that would normally pass through on a healthy week before this war ever started, when roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and a fifth of global liquefied natural gas moved through that one stretch of water. That's the scale of what's being strangled right now, and it's why every single time you hear about a new interdiction or a new interception, it's not just a headline, it's a direct input into what happens to your gas prices 2 weeks later. Speaking of which, let's talk about the price tag on all of this, because it's not staying overseas. The average price of a gallon of gasoline in the United States right now sits at $4.07, compared to $3.15 this same time last year. That's not inflation doing its normal thing. That's the Strait of Hormuz doing what the Strait of Hormuz does whenever it gets unstable, which is to remind the entire planet that a huge chunk of global energy still has to funnel through one narrow stretch of water that one determined regional power can make miserable with a handful of drones and a couple of fast boats. And that pain isn't limited to American drivers either. Every economy that imports Gulf oil and gas is eating some version of this same shock right now, which is exactly why so many countries outside this conflict are quietly pushing both sides towards some kind of resolution, and why insurance premiums for tankers, willing to even attempt the transit, have climbed to levels shipping companies haven't seen in years. And the response from Washington hasn't been subtle either. The Treasury Secretary went on record this week promising economic measures against Iran that, in his words, have never been seen before, layering that on top of the ongoing blockade that's already choking off anything trying to move in or out of Iranian ports. So you've got a two-pronged approach happening simultaneously. Military pressure on the water, cutting off weapons shipments and enforcing the blockade, and financial pressure on paper, squeezing whatever revenue streams Iran has left. Both of those pressure points are aimed at the exact same target, which is Iran's ability to sustain this fight for much longer, and both of them are clearly working, because you don't lash out with drone strikes on civilian tankers unless you're running out of better options. Now let's zoom in on what actually rides along with a shipment like the one that just got seized, because the hardware itself tells you everything about how serious this smuggling network really is. When investigators cracked open one of these floating arsenals not too long ago, what they found wasn't some ragtag pile of secondhand rifles. It was hundreds of components for anti-ship missiles. It was surface-to-air missile parts. It was underwater weapons, actual naval mine and torpedo-adjacent hardware designed to threaten warships, not just merchant vessels. Some of it arrives disassembled, shipped as what investigators have started calling do-it-yourself kits, coded parts that mean nothing on their own but snap together into a functioning weapon system once they reach a workshop on the other end. That's not incompetence, that's a deliberate design choice, because disassembled components are harder to identify, harder to prosecute, and harder to trace back to a single point of origin if the boat gets searched. And the paperwork found alongside these shipments is almost more damning than the hardware itself. Assembly manuals written entirely in Farsi. Manufacturer markings tracing straight back to companies affiliated with Iran's Ministry of Defense, companies that are already under direct U.S. sanctions for exactly this kind of activity. This isn't ambiguous. This isn't a case where investigators have to squint and connect a bunch of circumstantial dots. The regime's own fingerprints are stitched into the packaging, down to the font on the manual covers. So when a shipment like that gets intercepted, you're not just taking away a few crates of gear. You're taking away the parts that would have eventually become a missile capable of threatening a warship, or a drone capable of threatening a tanker, or a mine capable of threatening an entire shipping lane. Every single one of these interdictions is, in a very real sense, a strike that never happened somewhere down the line, because the weapon never made it to the people who would have used it. Multiply that across dozens of seizures over the past year, and you start to understand just how many missiles, mines, and drones simply never got the chance to fire, and how much quieter this war would have gotten by now if even half of these shipments had slipped through undetected. But here's the thing that makes this whole cat and mouse game so frustrating from a military standpoint. Even with all of these seizures piling up month after month, shipment after shipment, the flow never fully stops. It slows down, sure. It gets more expensive and more difficult for Iran to run, absolutely. But the geography just does not cooperate with anybody trying to fully seal it off. You've got a coastline that stretches for well over 1,000 miles, countless small inlets, fishing villages, and unregulated ports where a wooden boat can slip out at night without ever showing up on a radar screen, built to track large commercial traffic. You cannot brute force your way into covering every single mile of that with warships. It's a numbers game, and the ocean is simply too big for full coverage no matter how many destroyers you throw at it. That's exactly why this fight has increasingly turned into an intelligence and surveillance game rather than a pure firepower game. The interdictions that succeed are the ones where somebody already knew roughly where to look before the boat ever left port. Satellite tracking, human intelligence, informants inside shipping networks, pattern of life analysis on known smuggling routes, all of that feeds into a decision about which stateless dhow gets boarded on a given Tuesday and which one sails right past unnoticed. And when you get it right, like whatever happened with this most recent seizure, you don't just win a tactical victory, you deny an entire resupply cycle to a network that was counting on that shipment landing on schedule, throwing off timelines that might take weeks or months to rebuild. That's also why Iran's navy is effectively boxed in right now, and why their conventional options for hitting back have narrowed so dramatically compared to where they stood even a year ago. Their air force took catastrophic losses in the opening days of this war, and has never come close to recovering parity. Their proxy network, which used to be the crown jewel of their asymmetric strategy, is getting squeezed from both directions, choked off from resupply on the sea and hammered directly by Israeli and American strikes whenever it pokes its head up. So what's left? Drones, fast attack boats, mines. Cheap, deniable, hard to attribute weapons that can hit a tanker without requiring the kind of sustained military campaign that Iran simply can't afford to run anymore. That's why every time you see a headline about a tanker getting hit in the Strait, you shouldn't read that as a sign of Iranian strength. Read it as the opposite. It's the behavior of a country that has run out of better tools and is left swinging with whatever's cheapest and least traceable. A drone strike on a civilian tanker doesn't require an air force. It doesn't require a functioning navy. It just requires a garage, some off-the-shelf parts, and a willingness to escalate against unarmed shipping, because you can't win a fair fight against the actual military forces arrayed against you. And that desperation is showing up in some genuinely bizarre places too. Take the oil spill situation developing right now off Qeshm Island. A tanker that got struck back in June eventually ran aground on a rocky, uninhabited stretch of Iranian coastline. Everyone evacuated. Nobody has claimed responsibility for the original strike. And now, months later, satellite imagery is showing the first signs of a serious oil leak, with independent environmental researchers estimating hundreds of thousands of gallons have already spilled out of a vessel that could have been carrying up to 40 million gallons total across its cargo holds. Dark oil residue is already collecting in the shallow coastal waters right off Qeshm. That's not a footnote. That's a slow motion. Environmental disaster unfolding in real time, sitting directly along the same coastline where Iran claims to exercise sovereign control. And nobody in Tehran seems to be in any hurry to deal with it, because they're too busy managing a two-front war against both the American blockade and their own economic collapse. Let's talk about the diplomatic angle for a second too, because it's honestly one of the stranger threads running through all of this. Pakistan has stepped in as a mediator, shuttling between Washington and Tehran, and there's been reporting suggesting the two sides are, in the words of Pakistan's own defense minister, close on some sort of arrangement regarding Hormuz. Officials on the Pakistani side have publicly said a deal could be close, even as both Iran and the United States keep hardening their public stances in the exact same window. That's a fascinating contradiction if you think about it. Behind closed doors, there might be genuine movement towards some kind of framework to reopen the strait. But out in public, on social media, in press conferences, both sides are doubling down on maximalist positions. Trump talking about eventually declaring Hormuz American territory once Iran is fully defeated. And Iranian officials firing back that the strait has been Iranian, is Iranian, and will remain Iranian no matter what gets said in a tweet or an election speech. That's classic negotiation theater. Nobody wants to look like they blinked first, so both governments keep performing strength for their domestic audiences, while quieter channels potentially work toward an actual off-ramp. Whether that off-ramp materializes or collapses the way so many previous ceasefires and memorandums of understanding have already collapsed this year remains to be seen, but it's worth watching closely. Because if Pakistan's mediation actually produces something durable, that could be the first real crack in a conflict that's been grinding on for nearly half a year with no clean end in sight. And it wouldn't be the first time a neutral third party ended up being the one to actually break a stalemate that two exhausted, entrenched sides couldn't break on their own. Meanwhile, on the military appointments front, there's been a quiet reshuffling happening inside Iran's own command structure that deserves more attention than it's getting. New commanders have been named across the Revolutionary Guard's naval wing, a shakeup that typically signals either dissatisfaction with how the current leadership has handled this war, or an attempt to bring in officers seen as more willing to take aggressive action. Either way, when you change out your naval commanders in the middle of an active blockade, that's not a routine personnel move. That's a signal that the regime itself isn't happy with how the maritime side of this fight is going, and that tracks with everything else we're seeing. Ships bottled up in port, smuggling routes getting cut one boat at a time. Revenue draining out at a reported rate of roughly $500 million a day during the height of the blockade. When the money and the ships stop moving, heads start rolling, even inside a regime that usually prizes stability and continuity above almost everything else. There's also a wider regional piece to this that connects right back to the same weapons pipeline. Just days before this latest seizure, Houthi forces claimed responsibility for striking a vessel they said was carrying Saudi military equipment through the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, even though Yemen's own transport ministry insisted the ship was simply carrying food. That contradiction alone tells you how murky and dangerous this entire theater has become, where a single vessel gets described completely differently depending on which side is doing the describing. Add in continued Houthi missile and drone attacks on port cities, ongoing threat warnings issued for Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, and Bahrain, and cyber activity tied to Iranian-affiliated hacking groups targeting water systems back in the United States, and you start to see just how many fronts this single conflict has actually opened up. The weapons ship story doesn't exist in isolation. It's one thread in a much bigger web that spans naval interdictions, missile strikes, cyber warfare, and now environmental disaster, all traceable back to the same underlying fight over who controls the flow of weapons and oil through this region. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how much coordination it takes to keep all of these pressure points running at once without them colliding into each other. You've got destroyers enforcing a blockade in the Gulf. You've got patrol boats hunting smuggling dhows in the Arabian Sea. You've got carrier air wings rotating in and out to keep pressure on Iranian territory itself. You've got Treasury officials building sanctions packages behind the scenes. And you've got diplomats quietly working a Pakistani back channel, all while public statements from every single party involved keep insisting nobody wants this to escalate any further. That's an enormous amount of moving pieces for any single government to manage, let alone two governments locked in an active shooting war. And it's honestly a small miracle that a single miscalculation somewhere along that chain hasn't already blown the whole thing wide open into something far larger than what we're seeing now. Now, let's connect this back to the broader shipping picture, because the numbers here really do tell the whole story on their own. 56 separate reports of vessel damage in and around the Strait of Hormuz since this war kicked off back in February, and that count doesn't even fully capture the most recent wave of attacks still being tallied. Every one of those incidents represents a merchant crew, ordinary sailors with zero stake in this geopolitical fight, caught in the crossfire of a conflict between two nations arguing over who gets to control a stretch of water that the entire global economy depends on. And every single time Iran launches one of these strikes, it's not operating in a vacuum. It's a direct response to something, a blockade tightening, a weapons ship getting seized, a diplomatic statement it didn't like. The pattern holds up again and again if you actually track the timeline instead of treating each incident as an isolated news story. So where does this actually leave things heading into the next stretch of this war? On one hand, you've got the United States and its partners methodically strangling Iran's ability to resupply its proxy network, one seized shipment at a time, backed by an economic pressure campaign that a top Treasury official is promising will get even harsher in the days ahead. On the other hand, you've got Iran cornered, running out of conventional options, leaning harder and harder into cheap asymmetric strikes against civilian shipping because that's genuinely one of the only cards left in its hand. And sitting on top of all of it, you've got a fragile, possibly promising diplomatic track running through Islamabad that could either produce the first real breakthrough of this entire war or collapse, just like every previous attempt has collapsed, sending both sides right back to trading missiles and seizures over one of the most consequential bodies of water on the planet. What's clear, no matter which direction this goes, is that the weapons ship story and the tanker strike story are not two separate headlines. They're the same story, told from opposite ends of the same chain. Every boat that gets seized tightens the noose a little further on Iran's proxy strategy. Every tanker that gets hit is Iran's answer to that tightening noose, a message that even cornered, even bleeding revenue at $500 million a day, the regime can still make the world feel the cost of squeezing it. And until one side runs completely out of leverage, or that Pakistani mediation actually produces a real, lasting agreement, expect this exact pattern to keep repeating. Seizure, retaliation, with gas prices, insurance rates, and global shipping schedules absorbing the shockwaves every single time. Before we wrap up, it's worth stepping back and asking the bigger question here, because that's really what determines how this whole thing ends. Can a blockade and a sanctions campaign actually break a regime's will before that regime manages to inflict enough pain on global shipping to force the other side to back off first? That's the real contest happening right now, more than any single battle or any single seizure. It's a war of endurance, fought as much through economic pressure and interdiction statistics as it is through missiles and warships. And right now, based on everything we just walked through, the momentum still appears to favor the pressure campaign. Iran's navy is boxed in. Its proxy supply lines are getting cut one shipment at a time. Its revenue is cratering under the weight of the blockade. And its response, striking civilian tankers with drones, is the kind of move a country makes when it's trying to manufacture leverage it no longer has naturally, not when it's actually winning. But wars like this rarely end cleanly, and predicting the next move with total confidence would be foolish. What we can say with real certainty is that every crate pulled off a stateless dhow in the Arabian Sea matters more than it looks like on the surface, and every drone that goes screaming toward a tanker in the strait is a direct answer to exactly that kind of loss. Keep watching the seizures, keep watching the retaliation. That's where this war is actually being decided right now, far more than in any single headline about carriers or airstrikes, and it's the thread that ties together everything from a stateless dhow in the Arabian Sea to a burning oil port on the coast of Qeshm Island. What do you think happens next? Does this quiet diplomatic track through Pakistan actually produce something real? Or does the next seized shipment just trigger another round of strikes in the strait? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I genuinely want to know where you think this is heading. And if you've been tracking this war closely, let everyone else know what you've noticed that hasn't been making the headlines yet. If this kind of deep dive into what's actually happening behind the surface level news clips is useful to you, go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already, so you don't miss the next update the moment something breaks. And share this with anyone you know who's trying to actually understand what's unfolding in the Gulf right now instead of just skimming the headlines. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.